I'm going to share my screen with you guys online. Today we are going to talk about autism spectrum disorders. We're going to start the day with this. And then on Thursday, we'll start talking about specific interventions. So we're going to look at autism spectrum disorders, kind of understanding the dynamics of it, how it's diagnosed. We're going to look at some. There is, just so you guys know, there is no known cause for autism spectrum disorder. There has been a lot of speculation on different things, and I want to debunk the mythology of autism spectrum disorders. So we'll, as much as we can, because there is so much that we don't know about autism spectrum disorders. And in reality, for you guys as teachers, fairly insignificant about the cause, because the cause is not as important for you guys as the outcomes and what the students are doing, so you can help work with the students and help them be back better. Unlike behavior disorders, we want to get down and find the nitty-gritty issue to help them do better behaviorally. Autism, it's about what behaviors they have and how we can help them be successful in the future. That's the big deal. So we're not going to be the Sherlock Holmeses of the causes, but I want to debunk some mythology with you guys, because it really does matter, because parents will want to get into a discussion with that. And unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, we have the internet, right? And I know medical doctors talk about this all the time, how frustrating it is when a patient comes in and has done all this research over an issue that they think they're having, and they think that they've got this obscure disorder from something far away, and when in reality it's they need to drink more water. You know, something simple like that, right? So we parents have a lot of misinformation, and maybe it's our job is to listen to what the parents have to say, and then say, my job is to take care of your child in the classroom, help them to become the best they can be, and learn. That's my job. It's not my job to change the world out there, it's change the world in here, right? So that's an important piece. Autism, I think we have the most advocate or adversarial parents in the world, because they think their ideas are the same. And I'm not being negative against parents. It's just, they just deal with a lot of stuff. And every morning they wake up and they're dealing with their child who is very difficult. And they're dealing with a grief of what could have been instead of what is, if that makes sense. So we will look at those pieces of that as we walk through. So we won't get to the strategies today. We'll get to the strategies on Thursday. And the thing that you're going to find are the strategies are going to be good for anybody. So that's a really powerful tool, because these are kids. All right, so let's get started. This is several years back. We had autism broken up into multiple different things. You probably today, we still hear, well, that child is Asperger's, right? You hear that? That's all gone. Pervasive developmental disorder, all gone. It is now under one umbrella term, and that was changed with the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, 5th edition. They said, it doesn't matter if you're on the high end of the spectrum or on the low end of the spectrum, it's autism spectrum disorder. Because it's very interesting when we start looking at things, there are similarities, and in the diagnosis we find the similarities among all the kids on the spectrum. I kind of believe that we're on the spectrum somewhere as people. We're on the very high end of the spectrum somewhere, because I think we have some of these things like, I know that I cannot tolerate tags in my shirts. That's a sensory issue with me. I know people, I'm kind of a Guy Fieri nut. I like Guy Fieri stuff, and I was listening to him talk the other day on a show, and he said that he doesn't like eggs at all. And it's not the taste of the eggs, he hates eggs, it's the texture of eggs that he doesn't like. So that's a sensory issue. Is there a food that you guys just cannot tolerate and you think about it? Is it sensory or is it taste, which is sensory? You know, those are things that we have. I had a kid that was on the spectrum that he didn't eat anything but white food. But if you think about things that are white, what's the texture of those things? Bread, mashed potatoes, rice, oatmeal, those kind of things. Soft texture, right? He did not like crunchy things. So we had to work with him to get him desensitized to those so he would eat other things. So it was very interesting. And so like we'd bring in jicama, which is a crunchy white thing, and say it's a white thing. So he would try it, and then he said, I don't like it. And so we had to get him to verbalize, I don't like the crunchy things, not white things. Once we had him verbalizing that, then we started saying, now what's the taste, and let's work on those things. He was very high functioning. It's just interesting. But I know a lot of people that do that, a lot of people that don't like their food touching. And so you have to all have it separate. It's interesting. My sister would eat one thing at a time on a plate because she didn't like how things combined when you stack them or whatever. But I don't know. It's just different. So let's look at the DSM-5 description of autism. It says it's persistent. What does persistent mean? Think of that term, persistent.
It's like reoccurring.
Occurring like all the time. There's no break from it. It is constantly happening. It's persistent. No matter where you're at, what you're doing, it is there. So persistent means it's happening all the time. Deficits, so areas of that they're not as doing as well. In social communication, so social communication, let's define that, means talking to people, correct? Interacting with people, giving and getting information. What you're going to find with kids on the high end of the spectrum is they're very vocal, but they're very terrible at listening to other people, but they're very good at telling you about everything, right? They'll tell you to ad nauseum about something. I was working with a professional that said that he had a student that knew everything about every kind of deep fat fryer that's out there. And the guy would tell you all about it, deep fat fryers. So that's an interesting piece. So social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, that means different places, as it is manifested by the following are by history. So it has to be happening or you have a history of it. So we have deficits in social emotional reciprocity. That means the interaction. One of the big things that we look for with kids on the spectrum, do we have that social reciprocity with stuff? So like, for example, if you stood and you started looking up in the sky, what do people do? People come and they kind of look up in the sky with you, right? That's social reciprocity. But they don't see that social cue as something that they need to do. So they don't do that. They kind of stand there and wonder why people are standing around in a circle. And so if we use the dead look, they don't get it. And you guys know what I mean about the dead look or the mom look. You better knock that crap off or you're going to be in trouble when you get home. They don't get it. So that's it. That's social reciprocity. Huge, huge thing. And that's very important for learning, is it not? Social reciprocity. Most of us are constructivist theory teachers, which means that we believe, and we're more leaning toward the Vygotsky approach, which is about that learning occurs in a social environment, correct? Isolated learning is not as powerful as the group learning power. So that's Vygotsky's social learning theory, which is huge. And so these guys don't fit to that category very well. They don't do that very well. So deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to just reduced sharing of interest, emotions, or affect. A lot of times kids on the spectrum will talk like they are robots, kind of like a computer would talk. They would just give you the facts. Their voices don't up, raise, and lower like with emotion. It's very, very, right? Which is kind of interesting now. We just got Echo Dots in our house, this fun thing. And I just drives me nuts is that we named one of our plugs Marvin, for Marvin, the antisocial robot from a book that I read when I was in high school. And so we say to Alexa, turn off Marvin. And she's saying, okay, Marvin's turned off. And you know how it does that? And then I want to say, thank you. And my wife does the same thing. But that's that social emotional reciprocity. We're being kind of trained not to have that as much anymore. It's interesting. But then the voice on the other end used to be very robotic. Now it's got lots of emotion and different things, and it'll tell you jokes and all sorts of stuff. So it's interesting. Our artificial intelligence is becoming socially appropriate, whereas many of our social interactions are not. So then we drop to 2, deficits in nonverbal communication. This is what we call theory of mind stuff. And we'll talk about that in a minute, and I'll show you a video about theory of mind issues. Theory of mind is a very interesting concept. How do you know when you're talking to somebody that they're interested in what you're talking about? How do you know? Do they have eye contact with you? Do they put the appropriate uh-huhs and grunts and acknowledgments and shake their head and stuff? That is an indicator that they're listening to you for the most part, that you can tell. How do you know that that's for sure? It's that we make that assumption that we're reading their body behaviors to say this is what they're thinking. How can you tell if they're bored or not interested? They won't look at you, they're looking around, they're fidgeting, all these things. Also, if you know they're interested, they're leaning forward, they're with anticipation in a class, they're taking notes. You know, all these things are theory of mind. We're looking at this and interpreting what we think they're meaning. And so theory of mind is huge, and kids on the autism spectrum do not read social cues at all. They're very concrete. And what that means is what you say out of your mouth is what they believe, rather than what they interpret from your behaviors. Make sense? They've got to make beard masks that allows us to keep it on our nose. Every time it's my beard. Going to the store, my wife's always pulling my mask up because it's falling down. Okay, so that's a nonverbal communication. You don't do eye contact. In my research, I was working with a young man. He was 5th grader, and I was trying to get him to work on having social interaction, eye contact. And he was on the spectrum, and he said, "It hurts me." And I said, "That's an interesting concept. What do you mean by it hurts you? Help me understand." And he says, and he started talking about his feeling when he has eye contact with someone. And it came back more, he felt uncomfortable with eye contact. It wasn't that it hurt him physically, it hurt him emotionally in a sense, right? And he felt uncomfortable. And he equated uncomfortable with hurt, pain. So we had to reframe that for him and say that's uncomfortable, it's not painful. And so after we got that reframed, then he said he would be able to do some self-talk when he was feeling uncomfortable with eye contact and say, "I know this is uncomfortable with me right now in my head." This had to be in his head, but I need to do this so I can interact with these people. And so when we were able to get that for him in place, then he was able to say, move into other situations and be more socially engaged. Interesting, isn't it? You know, when we start looking at how these kids and these deficits and how we address those, he became so much more involved in class, his grades and his achievement went through the roof because of his interaction with that. And that just that one little self-talk thing. Have you ever encountered something like that? Where, like, for example, I used to hate being in front of people when I was younger. I hated it. But now you can get me up in front of 5,000 people and I'll be okay and talk and tell jokes and have fun and interact. It's because I had to train my self-talk in my head that it's just my nerves and to put my nerves somewhere else, right? So those are the things that we need to do with the kids in here. The third deficit that we look at is deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding the relationships. They don't have good relationships. They difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social situations. What I call, they're not good social chameleons. And you need to be a good social chameleon in society, do you not? Know what the situation is and then adjust your behavior appropriately. Like going out on Friday night, your behavior is different than it is Sunday at church, let's say, right? Your behavior with your friends is different than it is with your parents. Your behavior with your parents is different than it is with your behavior with your professors. Not so much, but it is still, right? So there's some pieces, and that's the imaginative play. They don't see the purpose of imaginative play. They don't do that well at all. So those are some pieces. Then the second big deal is restrictive, repetitive patterns of either behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by at least two of these down here. So they have some repetitive things, what we call stereotypical behavior. It could be that they do the flicking thing. There's the flicking thing with their hands, or flapping, or rocking. That could be repetitive behaviors. But it's not only behaviors, it's interests. The hyper-focused interests. Like when they're 3 years old and they're hyper-focused interest in flipping the light switch on and off constantly. That could be a sign of being what we would call OCD kind of like behaviors, right? So these are really big. We see a lot of this. Lining up toys rather than, you'll see them lining up all their toys rather than playing, like with all their cars are lined up like in a parking lot, rather than just moving around and interacting. So that's an interesting thing. Echolalia is a big deal. Echolalia is, there are different types of echolalia. That's repeating phrases that was said. For example, if you're talking to them, you might say, it's time to go to the to art, and they say, to art. Immediate echolalia. Then there's delayed echolalia. And I had a young man that he would come in and he would, from the moment it would begin to the time it ended, there was a television show he just loved, and he would say it exactly the way, word for word, everybody's part, plus the commercials and everything, from the beginning of the show to the end of the show. That's delayed echolalia. And that's strange. You think that's verbal skills, but that's not verbal skills, because even though he's talking, it's just repeating. It's not. But we can take those behaviors and adjust them accordingly to get some verbal behaviors going. The next thing, so that could stereotype repetitive movements or the way they use objects. Insistence on sameness is huge. They do not like change. It has to be this way, the way it's been forever and ever, and then we'll, if not, I'll have a meltdown, right? So, sameness, but there's a way to get by that. That's very interesting. Highly restricted fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity. Gamers, I mean, they kind of fall into that. You know, people that play games all the time, and all they talk about is World of Warcraft or what's the newest version of games. Fortnite. Is Fortnite still a thing? I don't know. I don't have time for all that. My son's really into Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer, but that's his. He's focused on that all the time. I just can't do that. So highly restricted fixated interests. Hyper or hypo sensory input. Interesting. Hyper or hypo. Hyper means they're sensory seeking. They need to get input from their senses. So they're going to be doing things to get that. Hypo means they're trying to avoid all that. They are oversensitized by the sensory input. So they're trying to escape it all the time. And that would be like hypo active to that. It would be they're trying to avoid the tags on their shirts, so they take their clothes off. You know, that's the, so it's kind of interesting. They might need unusual sensory inputs given to them. It's different smells, different sights, different touches, different things like that. So they're sensory seeking or sensory defensive, one of the two. And we all fall into one of those two realms. We're either sensory seeking or sensory defensive for the most part, one way or the other. Then we look at C, symptoms must be present in early developmental period. Remember, developmental period goes to 18. The early developmental period is before 6 and under, okay? So we look at that. Usually we see the symptomology around 18 months. We can do a kind of a restricted diagnosis at 18 months with kids. The next thing, symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current function. Occupational is broader than work. Occupational also means leisure time activities. So social, occupational are other important causes of function in that area. There are clinically significant deficits there. And then these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability. There can be a comorbid with ID and autism. A lot of times, though, it's because they're not communicative. Say that 3 times fast. They're not communicating well, and that tends to make us think that they're intellectually disabled, but they might not be. They just don't have the ability to tell us, right? So that's an important piece. Let's see. So we have to rule out ID as the primary cause of their dysfunction. So now then, I want to share a video with you about the whole vaccine issue. This is a little older. How many of you still hear that vaccines, the mumps, rubella, German measles shot is the thing that causes autism? How many of you still hear that? That study was done years ago in England, and the researcher lied. It was bunk, totally wrong. There is no link whatsoever to autism and the vaccine. Nothing. All the stuff they said would cause that has been removed from that. Now there might be a reaction to stuff that might be there, but this video will kind of explain it better, so it'll be interesting to hear. But that, in fact, the England's medical journal retracted that study. The man lost his license to be a medical doctor in England, and now he lives in Austin. So it's kind of wreaking havoc in Austin. Okay, we'll watch this video. It's interesting.
The following KQED production was produced in high definition.
4-year-old Megan Wallace is taking part in the largest research project in the U.S. on the causes of autism. Researchers don't yet understand what produces this developmental disorder. At Kaiser's San Jose Medical Center, psychologist Thomas Crawford tests Megan by engaging her in different ways. The symptoms he sees confirm the autism diagnosis he made 2 years ago.
Very rarely that she looked at me unless I actively called her name. Megan, look at me. Megan, look up here. When I tried to direct her attention to the bunny across the room, twice, at least 2 or 3 times, she couldn't follow my gaze. She didn't know the eyes are important for knowing her intention. Right. It made it more clear with the gesture, look at that, because she was able to track.
Megan is one of 900 autistic children nationwide who will help Kaiser and the Centers for Disease Control in a study called SEED. The research aims to unveil the causes of autism.
We feel, my husband and I both feel that, if you don't know why it's happening, parents aren't going to be empowered to make the best decisions they can for their kids.
Get them all.
Autism ranges from subtle to severe, but most autistic children have a very hard time following social cues. They display repetitive behaviors and have difficulty communicating and interacting. Although a few medications can sometimes help, the disease's symptoms are generally treated by working to modify behavior and improve interactions with others. In the 1990s, the number of diagnoses of the classic form of autism increased by 300% in California, and the numbers continue to climb, prompting officials to call it a public health crisis.
20 years ago, it was very uncommon to see children in the regional center system with autism. Today, our regional center, for example, here in Sacramento, Alta California Regional Center, we're averaging about 1 diagnosis each day, 7 days a week.
Nationwide, 1 in every 158-year-old children is on the autism spectrum. The spectrum includes classic autism and 2 other forms of the disease, Asperger's.
So you can see this is a little dated. The statistics are now like 50 out of every 50 births, 1 person is diagnosed with autism. So it's even higher than that. This is about, 10 years old now, but it's still a valid video.
And PDD-NOS. Researchers are vigorously debating what this increase means. Are more children developing the illness, or are other factors like better diagnosis at play? Ron Huff, who is in charge of diagnoses at Sacramento's Regional Center, believes that at least part of the increase is a true increase in cases, and that it's not simply a case of more accurate diagnosis.
Where are those older 20, 30-year-olds that were missed 15 or 20 years ago that otherwise would have been diagnosed with autism? When we look into the community, we don't see those people.
So what is making today's kids sick? While Kaiser works on its SEED study, UC Davis is focusing on autistic children while they're still in the womb as part of its own study called MARBLES. Today, UC Davis researchers are visiting the Newberry family in Citrus Heights, north of Sacramento.
Hi.
They've been following 6-month-old Hayden since he was in utero. They're interested in Hayden because his 5-year-old brother Jason is autistic.
Hi, Jason. Come sit right here. Okay.
Studies show that 10 to 15% of couples with an autistic child will have another autistic child. This unfortunate statistic gives researchers the opportunity to study these autistic children and their mothers from pregnancy on. The MARBLES study has so far enrolled 70 families with an autistic child.
The idea behind this study is that if there are early factors that influence autism, we would like to be able to study them as they happen and not be trying to get people to remember, well, what happened when you were pregnant.
And any significant events in his life.
I was excited about the research project because I'd have more people watching Hayden other than just his pediatrician and myself.
In this simple test, if Hayden doesn't respond to his name, it could be an early sign of autism.
Oh, good job.
Though autism runs in families, there isn't a unique autism gene. But Hertz-Picciotto and her colleagues have identified 11 genes that act differently in autistic children. These genes are found in the children's natural killer cells. Though they sound like villains, natural killer cells are actually superheroes of our immune system that attach to and kill cancer cells and viruses. So what does this link between autism and the immune system mean?
We don't know exactly how it's relevant. Is a change in immune function somehow underlying what causes the brain pathology? Or is it the brain pathology that causes the changes in the immune system? Or is it neither?
As research progresses, scientists expect to find that many different genetic factors interact with environmental factors to cause autism.
In one case, it might be one gene and 3 environmental factors. In another case, it might be 5 genes, a child who really is genetically loaded in a sense, and a single environmental factor might tip the scale. And those environmental factors might operate at different points in time.
We did this before. We did this in her 2nd trimester of pregnancy, and looking for pesticides, any sort of yucky stuff that mom, dad, and kids would be bringing in.
Long dominated by psychological and later genetic research, the autism scientific community only recently started looking at environmental factors. But some parents of autistic children have long voiced concerns that the environment is involved in their children's disease. They believe that vaccines are somehow connected to autism. This belief has been brought on in part by the fact that 15 to 40% of autistic children start developing in a typical fashion and then regress. That regression sometimes coincides with the time period around 18 months when kids get their booster shots.
After he got his last round of shots, I really noticed that he just regressed within the last couple of weeks, a week or 2 after that. He just completely changed. He wasn't seeing anymore. He wasn't playing with the dog. He wasn't doing anything. I mean, he didn't even know how to be potty trained anymore. So we had to put diapers back on him at about 2 years old.
Another source of parent suspicion stems from a small 1998 British study that suggested links between the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and autism. However, most of the researchers have since retracted the paper, admitting it did not produce sufficient evidence of a connection. Parents also suspected thimerosal, a mercury derivative, used as a preservative in some pediatric vaccines. It was eliminated from all but the flu vaccine in 2001. But the rates of autism have continued to climb. Concerned about guaranteeing that infectious diseases don't reemerge, public health officials have insisted that research doesn't bear out an autism vaccine connection. But based on its finding that the immune systems of autistic children are different than those of typically developing children, UC Davis's Mind Institute has taken a more nuanced approach to the issue. The Mind Institute suggests that a small number of children may respond to vaccines in an atypical way.
By and large, vaccines are safe and they're effective. At the same time, the number of vaccines that we give in a very short period of time may be too much for some children. And maybe it's because those children had other things that happened to them prenatally, I don't know. Or maybe it's a genetic predisposition, or maybe there's just some subset of the population within the norm that are at one end of sensitivity where, 15 vaccines in a short period of time, is not right. It is not what they can handle.
It's now common for parents and pediatricians to spread vaccines out over time.
For Hayden, as far as immunizations go, we have done an extended plan. He will have his immunizations up until he's 4 instead of 2. I feel it's important to have him immunized. I wouldn't not immunize him.
Both the Kaiser and the UC Davis studies will look at the vaccination histories of children and mothers, and they will also look at a whole host of other lifestyle and environmental factors.
When was the last time anyone sprayed pesticides inside?
Probably about 6 months ago in the playroom and the bathroom.
And all the mothers ask, should I stop doing this? Should I stop doing that? So we have to tell them, probably you want to avoid as much as you can some of the unnecessary chemicals.
Research has already revealed some links. In 2008, Hertz-Picciotto and her colleagues published that mothers of autistic children were twice as likely to report they had used household insecticides and pet shampoos.
So we can't say at this point, well, we've established some causal link, because that's not what we've done. We've just shown some evidence of an association.
While the Newberrys hope to contribute to the understanding of why children become autistic, when it comes to their own son, their focus is on the future. After Jason's first year in the local school's autism program, his parents are noticing improvements, and they're working to reinforce his newly acquired social skills.
One of his goals for this year is to be able to answer a question, who, what, when, where, why, rather than just mimicking the question. What is that? What's his name? Monkey. Monkey?
Keep Quest free. Discover more and donate at kqed.org.
So, what'd you guys think? Does that make more sense? It's kind of like there's some genes, and when you encounter the appropriate environment, then things happen, and it makes more sense to me rather than the other. And it could be that it was what was in the shot could have been the thing that was precipitating them. So you never know. So it's recommended to be more careful about things and kind of watch that. And so move forward. Again, for teachers, I think this is just interesting, right? If it's not going to change what we do. Because we're going to take care of the child because they're there. There's nothing you can do. Once a child has been diagnosed with autism, you can't go back and make them on the spectrum. They're already there. So that's an interest. We can help move them up and down. On Thursday, I'll bring some video of Temple Grandin. You guys know Temple Grandin. She's a spokesman for autism. Her story is very interesting. At 3 years old, she was non-verbal completely. But now she goes around the world telling about autism, and also most of the slaughterhouses in the United States is her design. She's slaughtering animals decently is her thing. So if you have a chance, it's a really good movie. The Temple Grandin story is a really good movie, and Claire Danes did an excellent job as Temple, and it would explain it very well. Just a fun movie, could be a date movie, it'd be kind of interesting. It's fun. I have it in my office if anybody wants to borrow it. It's a DVD. So this is an interesting issue. I have other beliefs that don't fit the scientific realm, that fit the spiritual realm, but that's another story altogether. And I won't get into that here. If you have a question about that, come talk to me in my office. Okay, so as we've mentioned, there are 5 key dimensions in autism spectrum disorders: social, communication, cognitive, interest, and sensory. And each of these have a range or a spectrum of expression. And all of us kind of fit on a spectrum of expression of this. We might be more social than we are, and some of our interests are not so hyper-focused. But kids on the spectrum all are either very low, very high, or somewhere in between. So let's look at each of these pieces. So like the social dimension of autism, when we think of classic autism down here on this end, it's the individual is aloof, they avoid social interaction, they don't have eye contact with you. It's almost like when you talk to them, they are deaf, but they're not. And then you see on the very other side is the high functioning autism, what was called Asperger's syndrome before. The individual is active, but they're odd. Think Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. That's active, but odd. They tend to interact better with adults than they do children. And they are very idiosyncratic. That means unique to them, and they're in very immature ways. They don't interact real well. So it goes from the really aloof to the very active God, but then they're still aloof in a sense, even though they're talking to you, they're talking at you or through you, not with you. There's a difference. So it's kind of like being a professor. I talk at you guys, but I like to talk with you guys. So that's the thing. And you probably notice the professors have fit this really, really well, don't you? It's kind of funny when you learn all these things, you kind of diagnose your professor. You say, oh, he's on the spectrum. Oh, yeah. But that's the interesting thing. And so, and you probably know your friends that kind of fit here too. So that's the social dimension. So classic autism on one end, the high functioning on the other. Communication dimension, on the one end, there's no spoken language whatsoever. But behavior is a communication to us. And then on the high functioning end, they might be very fluent, kind of like Sheldon, but they're talking way over our heads, right? So, and they have trouble that interaction with you. So it goes from one end to the other end. The cognitive dimension, you're going to have kids on the far end, because of the lack of language, that are profoundly deficit in learning. At least they can't tell you what they know. So it's very, and then you have up here, these guys are like real smart, and they have lots of stuff. They have really great academically, maybe in one area or another, but not in all areas. And it's usually they're quite precocious and haughty in the way that they demonstrate that they know stuff. Very much like Sheldon. I mean, if I put a picture of Sheldon up here, you guys would say, yeah, that's it, I got it, right? So it's very interesting. Interest dimension, they can go in the classic side where their preoccupation with parts like ceiling fans, spinning wheels on cars, little itty bitty things, flipping switches, those kind of things, to the high functioning end where it's like they remember every single baseball statistic of every single baseball player they ever lived. And that's not savant skills, that's just a hyper-focus interest. So that's real interesting. And so it's, the middle, they might collect or hoard objects, you know, so you need to make sure that they're age appropriate. I worked with a young lady on the spectrum that loved dolls, and she liked playing with the dolls, but she was 18 years old. And playing with dolls isn't really an appropriate thing, but collecting dolls and changing their clothes and doing things like that is. So we have to reframe that context with her to make her more age appropriate. See, it's a reframing with the individual to help them be better. The sensory dimension, they go from being sensory seeking on one end, where they're neither needing sensory input, to sensory defensive on the other end. So it kind of goes from one extreme to the other. Sensory defensive to sensory seeking, or vice versa. Now the interesting thing is that autism, those dimensions that I showed, they're not rigid, they're not static. You can help students move from one to the other over time. And Temple's a perfect example. When she was 3 years old, she was nonverbal. But today she's extremely verbal on this end. And so you can see that is you can move up and down the spectrum given training. So you can help them be more typical and be able to be engaged better in their environment. You just have to know how to get there and find the keys to help them there. And we're going to talk about that. So children at 3 can be diagnosed with low functioning autism, but by the time they're 16, they could be diagnosed with high functioning autism. And I know Temple Grandin is one, and then I have another friend that Stephen Shore, who is very similar. At 3, he was diagnosed with low functioning autism, but he's a professor of special education in Boston and travels the world teaching on autism spectrum disorder. So that's an interesting thing. Theories of neuropsychological learning theories of autism. Here's some things that we see all the time with these guys. Delayed theory of mind, I mentioned that to you guys. Weak central coherence and impaired executive function. These are 3 big areas that we need to help them to get these skills so they can be able to learn in a typical classroom setting. So we're going to watch a little video of theory of mind pieces. Theory of mind, in a nutshell, is the inability to recognize and understand others' thoughts, beliefs, and interests. So basically, we kind of know how people think and their intentions and other things. We could see it through their behaviors and through social interaction, etc. We can interpret those things. Okay? So we're going to watch this. There's a Sally Ann test and the Smarties test. These are really interesting little videos. So we're going to watch it.
Children at play with one of their favourite activities. The water provides plenty of opportunities for learning and fun. As they grow up and take part in activities like these, one of the things that children need to be able to do is represent internally the complexity of their social worlds. This involves not just being able to predict how the world of objects works, but also how other people are likely to react in various situations. Psychologists have recently realized that in order to do this, a young child needs an idea about how people's minds work, what they have begun to call a theory of mind. And research over the last decade has suggested how this seems to appear quite rapidly and suddenly between the ages of 3 and 4 years.
The great thing about theory of mind is that it is a major conceptual tool that allows us to step outside of the bounds of the directly perceivable stimulus circumstances and allow for predicting and explaining other people's behavior in a wide variety of novel ways.
Psychologists argue that we can see the difference between having and not having a theory of mind in simple experiments called false belief tasks. First of all, the child has to establish the fact that their own belief is false. Then they have to put themselves inside the mind of another child in order to predict that child's beliefs.
Now, Elizabeth, what do you think's inside this box? Have a look inside. Oh, well, let me have a go. You ready? Say go. Go. What's in there? What's that?
Pencils.
Oh, right. Should we put them back in the box? Should we put the lid on? Now, can you remember what's inside the box?
Pencils.
And what did you think was in the box? Did you? I can show this box to Jay in a minute. What would Jay think is in the box? After you mopped up the child's tears because they expected to get sweets, you asked them two questions. One is a reality question to make sure they remember what's inside. So what is inside the box? And then you can ask them one of two false belief questions. One is about their own previous belief. What did you think was inside the box? And the second question is, your friend John is going to come and look at the box in a minute. What will John think is in the box? Like that?
Like many children of this age, when asked what another child will think, Elizabeth simply projects what she now believes herself about the tube of sweets. She doesn't recognize that the other child exists as an independent thinking being. And presented with another task of this kind, she acts in much the same way.
Right, now. This is Sally, and this is Anne. Right. Now, Sally comes in with a marble. Sally puts her marble into the basket and goes out. Anne comes, gets the marble. She puts the marble in the box. Here comes Sally. Here comes Sally. Now, where will Sally look for the marble?
There you go, Sally.
You got it for her! Hooray!
But for another child, Connor, the outcome is somewhat different.
Sally comes in to find her marble. Where will Sally look for her marble? And where was the marble in the beginning? That's it? Good. Should we look for the marble now? Where do you say the marble is? Have a look. Oh. That's it? Good. The joy of this procedure is that you can ask two control questions to make sure that they understand what the task is about. You can ask them a memory question, which is where was the object at the beginning? And of course the answer to that is at location A. And you can ask them a second reality question, which is where is the object now? Which of course is location B.
To be able to work out where Sally will think the marble is, Connor has to be able to simultaneously hold, or in psychological terms, mentally represent two distinct points of view in his mind. In the research studies, most 3-year-olds seem unable to do this.
On the age of about 4, children do not use the other person's mental representations as independent entities. They do not realize that individuals can act on misrepresentation. This is Sally.
But most 4-year-olds get the answers to these questions right. But why? what happens between the ages of 3 and 4?
So that's an interesting question. What happens is that we, the whole theory of mind piece let me ask you, what do you think from 3 to 4, there's a huge change? What do you think happens from 3 to 4? They pretty much told you in this thing. 3-year-olds, do they see other people as separate from themselves? Okay, so they see them as an extension, not the same. With kids, developmentally, it's really interesting to watch kids. At 2, they start doing this play, and if mom's there, they come back to mom, and then they go play. And if another child is there, they do what's called parallel play. They play alongside the child, right? But at 4, they start interacting with the child differently because they see the child as somebody different than themselves. That changes between 3 and 4. That's a social thing, perceptual thing that they see happening. So that's what happens here. So kids on the autism spectrum, they don't make that leap to seeing others as separate. They continue to see them as an extension of. So that's why they have this whole problem with theory of mind. Like the Sally Ann test. And it's interesting, isn't it, that little Elizabeth would think that everybody would think it's in the box, not in the basket where it was put in the first place. Because they don't hold that in their brain and working memory, that piece and the other piece. They can only have one, they have capability of one piece of information at a time. Make sense? So it's a developmental working memory piece that we see with these kids. So this is, again, as being a psychologist, I love the whole concept of looking at this because it's interesting to me. And then where I see people out there, that's why you see group think, that where people go into, all of a sudden they do something that you wouldn't normally do if you were by yourself. They do it together as a group because they're seen as one entity, not separate pieces. Independent thought versus group think. So that's a very interesting thing. Also, are you internal locus of control? Are you external locus of control? 3-year-olds have external locus of control. They haven't learned to be responsible for themselves. 4-year-olds are more able to be responsible for themselves. They have an internal locus of control of behaviors. So that's another interesting piece. And unfortunately, it seems like in our society, we have this Generation Z that's coming up. They seem to be very much external locus of control kids. So that's why behaviors in classrooms are so bad. It's interesting. Okay, so here's another interesting study done. They took kids they wanted to know, is this only we see this with kids on the autism spectrum? Do we see it with any other kind of kids? So they took kids on the autism spectrum, kids with Down syndrome and intellectual disability, and neurotypical developing kids. And they asked the theory of mind questions. The green represents they got it correct, the red represents incorrect. What do you see? Look at these graphs. What do you see? Very interesting study. Kids, neurotypical, us folk. What do you see? You see that for the most part we get the theory of mind questions correct, right? Have a very small percentage of the population that doesn't. What do we see over here with intellectual disability? Is it very similar? So the social piece is still there. Now they're immature socially, but they still see it correctly. What do we see here? It's completely different, isn't it? Very interesting study with this. So I show you this to say that this is quite unique for the kids on the autism spectrum. Now, weak central coherence. Highlight magazine. Whenever we would go to the doctor, I loved Highlight magazines. Did you guys love Highlight magazines? This is one of my favorite things, was looking for the stuff in the pictures. What is this a picture of? Can you tell me? Who is this fairy tale figure from American folklore? Johnny Appleseed. And what is he doing? He's planting apple seeds, right? So, but here's the thing. Kids on the autism spectrum have weak central coherence. We have a fairly intact central coherence. We can see the main idea, right? We see this as the main idea. But we have difficulty in identifying, sometimes finding the little bits from that's in the big idea. We get overwhelmed maybe sometimes with the big idea, we don't see the little bits. The kids on the autism spectrum, they'll do this like almost immediately because they see the pieces, they don't see the big picture. Make sense? So, like we can see here's a cone, there's there's a saucer up here, feather was in his somewhere. There's the crown, there's the feather, cuts on his knee. So, you can find these pieces, but for kids on the spectrum, they're real quick. So here's another example. Look at this picture. What can you tell me just by looking at this picture, what's going on in that picture? Why do you think she has her eyes shut? This sign says what? No swimming, right? What's this? Clothes. Whose clothes? Is it boys or girls? Boys' clothes, right? Look at the slingshot. So why do you think her eyes are shut? They're swimming in the pond. They're skinny dipping in the pond, right? So she has her eyes shut and she's not looking. Kids on the autism spectrum would never, ever get that. They'll just look at it and say, oh, look, there's clothes and there's her eyes are shut. She's carrying a basket. Is that Red Riding Hood? They'll ask, stuff like that. The details, they'll see the details. They won't see the big picture. They won't see the concepts. They'll see the details. See the difference? Impaired executive functioning. This is, we see this with kids with learning disabilities, emotional disturbance, ADHD, many kids with neurologically impairments will see this. Impairments in organizational planning abilities, working memory, inhibition and impulse control, time management, prioritizing, and that includes processing speed and the ability to use new strategies to solve problems. That's impairments like that. Don't you see them as problematic for kids in learning and social interactions, right? So those are some other things that we need to work on with these kids. Executive function skills, the frontal lobe. Possible comorbid disorders that we see with autism. There is a huge link being found now with epilepsy, seizure disorders. We see ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. It's very similar brain functions are impaired there. We sometimes see it with Down syndrome, sometimes see it with cerebral palsy, and et cetera. But we see the top two a lot. There's also many kids with autism that are diagnosed with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, but it might just be part of the autism, not truly an obsessive compulsive disorder. So these are things that are really interesting, the comorbid pieces. Secondary disorders, we see the high functioning kids with anxiety disorders and mood disorders. We definitely see conduct disorders, disorders of behavior. And they're very unclear that if they're characteristics of autism or they are separate disorders because of it. So it's kind of hard to know. So that's where we're going to end today. On Thursday, we're going to get into strategies, and we'll talk about these strategies and how you can use them with all students in your classroom. It'll be really awesome. We'll begin with a little video of a autism classroom so you can see it in action. Any questions about autism? It's interesting, isn't it? And hopefully I'm making it more so you can understand it. So the fear is that they're to work with these kids. That's the main thing. These are great kids, and you'll enjoy working with them. That's a lot of fun. All right, guys, stay well, stay warm, stay healthy, and we'll see you guys virtually on Thursday. Bye, guys. Bye, guys. We'll see you guys on Thursday face to face.